So my name is Ruth Blacksell and I am the Associate Professor at the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at Reading University. And as indicated in the title of my presentation, I'm going to focus on some of the interesting defining features of certain aspects of experimental publishing. And the examples I'm going to use are drawn from across a very specific 60-year period between the late 1960s and the present day. And the material for this talk is taken from my chapter in the forthcoming Bloomsbury Handbook of Global Typography, which I believe is coming out in February 2026. And some of it is incorporated into another chapter in The Anatomy of the Book, which is a planned publication from Valleys, which is co-edited by Fraser and Brad Haylock. So the focus of this talk, or the plan and focus, is to identify some of the underpinning editorial design features of what broadly gets called experimental publishing during this period, and also the links to new media. It will consider the inherent connection between these editorial designs and the alternative network cultures that the publication sought to represent and support. And it will look at how this went on to manifest itself in more recent alignments between experimental publishing and new archival initiatives. In addition, I'm going to aim to cross-reference from these experimental publishing practices to mainstream editorial design thinking, and to map connections between what might otherwise be understood as disparate engagements and examples. And as you'll see, I draw upon examples that have been instigated from outside of the graphic design world, which I think are extremely important to understanding why experimental design needs to look outside of its own parameters at other practices happening elsewhere. And I'm going to point to some of these emerging questions and preoccupations that exist in experimental publishing today. So accounts of the specific evolution of network publishing media during this era make particular reference to print-based magazines of the late 1960s, and particularly the inspiration provided by certain countercultural magazines through their specific connection to alternative network communities and cultures. For example, Steve Jobs, who was co-founder of Apple and pioneer of the personal computer revolution of the 70s and 80s, in his 2005 Stanford commencement address, referred to one such 1960s magazine, the Whole Earth Catalogue, as Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along. And there are many interesting things to say about the Whole Earth Catalogue, but just in the context of this discussion, it's interesting that for this publication and some of the other examples I'm going to refer to, the parallel with Google is rooted in engagement with very particular communities of readers, and the ways in which a nurturing of active community engagement fed into the rationale behind their editorial design. Tech entrepreneur Stuart Brand, who co-founded the Whole Earth Catalogue in 1968, had a utopian editorial vision to create a network for easy access to tools and knowledge exchange based on the idea of connected communities. And it was this same vision that was later advanced by Tim Berners-Lee in his development of the World Wide Web network. The central design feature of the Whole Earth Catalogue is, for example, derived from its positioning as a home reference manual, lifestyle guide and literary review within a mail order network. Its graphic look, which is featured on the left, was therefore purposefully derived from existing mainstream home reference mail order publications of the 1950s, such as the one produced by the popular retail company LL Bean, which is featured on the right. And it was even stated in the first issue that the Bean catalogue was the model for the Whole Earth Catalogue. So here, the Whole Earth Catalogue was relying upon its readers' existing cultural familiarity with a mainstream editorial design format whilst building a new audience through a countercultural pitch on back to the land agrarianism and sustainability. A similar treatment was adopted for the new Women's Survival Catalogue produced 5 years later in 1973, which, despite the magazine's alternative critical feminist focus on a feminist community and their interests, remains visually consistent with the Whole Earth catalogue. So Ken Kesey's 1971 editorial statement on how to do a Whole Earth catalogue could be equally applied to either of these publications. On the left is a spread from the New Women's Survival Catalogue, and on the right is a spread from the Whole Earth Catalogue. So to quote Kesey, who's perhaps better known for his novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in laying out the Whole Earth Catalogue, we used a tabloid-sized page, like the magazines in Sunday papers, and you had enough space on each page and spread to lay out a graphic array of information with multiple visual relationships and plenty of freedom for the reader to pick their own path. Design writers Lorraine Wilde and David Carwin take this up further in describing how readers were invited to wander through the even distribution of dense information that they had to edit for themselves, thereby participating in what might be described as a collective project. The experimental magazine Aspen, published between 1965 and 71, so in tandem with these catalogue examples, was similarly designed to connect via mail exchange with an identified community of readers, and it shared the same ambition for a graphic array of information with multiple visual relationships and readers free to pick their own paths. However, rather than adopting the catalogue genre for its editorial design, it developed a unique curated approach to the magazine form, whereby the mail distribution container acted as a boxed cover within which to accommodate a bespoke array of flat and folded items with multiple formats, both bound and unbound, which could be navigated and assembled by the reader in any order. So the art world readers of Aspen would have been familiar with, or at least open to, the notion of curatorship and differing documentations of art practice. So the development of a design rationale in response to this community echoes the example demonstrated by the catalogues. The art world Aspen readership would have had no problem with their role as active users in navigating and assembling the contents of each boxed issue. And alongside the Whole Earth catalogue, Aspen is often cited as another important experimental, largely print-based precursor to the subsequent evolution of thought behind digital network publishing. As the quote by media theorist Marshall McLuhan states on the box of Aspen 4 in 1967, any understanding of social and cultural change is impossible without a knowledge of the way media work as environments. So here, McLuhan was pointing explicitly to a new form of practice that would require the understanding and the appropriation of an entire mediating context and structure. In the case of Aspen, this was played out within the mediating context of editorial publishing. So on closer inspection, these precursors to the ones I'm going to get to have added complexity in their editorial design and ambitions. From its outset, the Whole Earth catalogue had declared its focus on whole systems, communication, community and learning, with this sentiment captured in the framing statements of the publication. The flow of energy through a system acts to organise that system. A realm of intimate personal power is developing, power of the individual to conduct their own education, find their own inspiration and shape their own environment and share their adventure with whoever is interested. So the notion of readers picking their own paths reflects this aspiration, and all three of the publications I've shown here make conscious efforts in their editorial design to disrupt the possibility of a singular linear reading, to enable open and varied navigational choice. Here, in the Whole Earth catalogue, typographic and illustrated cross-referencing was used to encourage users to undertake an exploratory, non-linear reading strategy, both inside and beyond the publication. And here, in Aspen, the use of a multi-format and loose-leaf approach was accompanied by explicit editorial statements and contributions to embed emerging theories of active readership within its curated contents. For example, Dan Graham's editorial note for Aspen number 8 in 1968 replaces the passive noun information with the active descriptor information and proposes that a reader's mind's eye is changing, their position continually shifting. The signs on the page function simply as vectors switching terminuses in the transaction between the activating authorial mover, the world out there, and the activated moved reader. So it is worth a quick look, and I could go on forever about conceptual art practices that were experimenting with these ideas, but a quick look at the work of Dan Graham away from Aspen magazine, since he is a number of conceptual artists who at the time specifically used text and image insertions or interventions into mainstream and self-published magazines to create iterative works where the content could remain in a state of open flux through the process of republication, rather than existing in any fixed form within a single document. These further align with theoretical ideas such as Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, Birth of the Reader from 1965, and Karen Barrad's agential realism of the early 2000s, where matter and material are depicted as iterative, co-constituted and inherently entangled and dynamic. Further considerations of such published works and theoretical mappings is therefore very relevant to the expanded discussion and understanding of experimental publications featured in this talk. So, as noted, the focus of these experimental publications on whole systems, open works and network communities was also at the root of the developments in personal computing in the 1970s and 80s and the associated progression of digital experimental publishing. As Fred Turner notes in his 2006 book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, The Rise of Digital Utopianism, the computer industry was building systems to link communities, and Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Catalogue knew this because he was sitting in the middle of the Californian tech world. As such, a second entry point for this discussion is to consider the ways in which specific moves into digital and hybrid experimental publishing have continued to draw upon and become intrinsically defined by the identification and exploration of networks, and specifically alternative networks. So it's also worth looking at the ways in which progressions from experimental print into digital publishing have continued to interrogate and develop interactive and open reader engagements, since this design characteristic would come to underpin their connection with network cultures. Through its early experiments with digital desktop publishing, the magazine Emigre is an obvious point of reference here, first published in Berkeley, California in 1984. In particular, it provides an example of the ways in which experimental publishing used the new desktop publishing tool to further disrupt and manipulate conventional reading strategies. In their rejection of modernist fixed formalism, the first issues of Emigre to experiment with the desktop design and publishing capabilities of early Apple Macs show, for example, how immersive and progressive reading was successfully undermined via digitally rendered manipulations of the typography, page layout, and document flow, as indicated here by the coloured overlays to show that how conventional layout and text flow for different elements of content are interrupted and extended across successive pages. The rejection of fixed formalism was, however, only one aspect of the postmodern shift. Alongside this, there was also a further comprehensive move away from medium specificity in experimental publishing. Unlike the earlier Aspen, examples like Emigre are limited in this respect, since despite using digital publishing as their design tool, their final form remains largely fixed form, print-based. However, subsequent examples went on to fully integrate print and dynamic digital media into their final published outcomes, and it's this which ultimately starts to truly elevate active readers into co-creators. This example is a publication produced by the Serving Library, an experimental publishing practice that presents itself through an active process of editorial design, publishing, archiving and distribution, articulating itself via the hybrid circulating relationships it sets up between its printed bulletins, bound and distributed as journal articles, and their digital counterparts, PDFs that can be accessed via image text hyperlinks, via an online digital web-based archive or Serving Library. And contemporary editorial designers like Mindy Su, producer of the 2022 Cyberfeminism Index, once again pay homage to their earlier experimental predecessors in anticipating this progression. In particular, Su refers back to features like the cross-referencing devices in the Whole Earth catalogue as analogue precursors to the digital hyperlink and feedback loops used by active readers. So when she points to the hybrid print and digital media forms of this, which is her own experimental publication, we're clear about the underpinning progression she aligns to, including design features that expand upon dynamic, user-generated content. For Mindy Su, her publication's focus on cyberfeminism allows for a productive merging of the interests of cybernetics and feminism. Her incorporation of feedback loops references cybernetics via the idea of users impacting on a system and the system then impacting back on them. The active feedback loop would therefore serve to progressively generate a more representative, diverse, feminist user network. Responding to characterizations of early digital cultures as straight, white, Western and male, the crowdsourced and open content gathered here for the Cyberfeminism Index uses the expanded active user network as a defining experimental feature of the publication. Referring back once again, Sue reminds us of the aim of the New Woman's Survival catalogue to counter the predominantly white male remit of the Whole Earth catalogue, and she describes her method of editorial gathering as a rhizomatic approach to content categorization and editorial design, where she similarly embraces multiple non-binary exit and exit points for more diverse feminist users and user journeys. Here, Sue cites the theoretical ideas of Ursula Le Guin and Donna Haraway from the 80s and 90s in her use of the gathering descriptor. So as featured on the slide, Sue describes her first container for the Cyberfeminism Index as an open source, open access, crowdsourced spreadsheet inviting users to submit proposed content for consideration. The container is designed to counter what she refers to as the rigid top-down regularity and rectangularity that characterizes conventional spreadsheet data structures and protocols. Through her purposefully multivarious taxonomic categorizations, the content gathering for the Cyberfeminism Index encourages multiplicity and self-identification rather than enforcing fixed binaries. The resulting range of selected classifications within each entry can then feed productively into the cross-referencing descriptors of the published index. In short, the aim is to use this method of collective authorship to enable more inclusive representation of feminist user communities and subject matters, and to welcome contributions where new connections can form and develop. So, following the same rationale, the responsive document design of the online index is rooted in the same commitment to user-generated content. At first, the text appears in a seemingly default tabular arrangement, but as Sue describes, upon interaction, the site is made to feel unusual with a breathing green blur as you scroll through. And when you click on your selections, they are highlighted in green and copied over to a side margin as a responsive learning trail, which can be downloaded as a personalised and dated PDF record of your own reading activity. The soft copy index at cyberfeminismindex.com thus produces a living publication of individual learning trails created through random clicking or more purposeful searching. The hard copy, Cyberfeminism Index book, which is I have here, is on the other hand functioning as a static document, but also encourages individual, non-linear reading through its editorial design. The front section of the book features collections where contributors have each selected their 10 to 20 entries based on a theme for a personally guided tour of the book. And within the entries are a plethora of green pill cross-referencing cues to entries in the later index section of the book, which themselves include further cross-referencing cues to give the reader even more options for exploration. As the critic Nora Khan notes, roaming around the collection and the different examples it presents moves you away from the desire or the ability to have one overriding master narrative and makes you keep engaging with the collective thinking that is within the index. So, through this turn to a focus on user-generated network cultures, such experimental publications increasingly rely upon modes of active networking and cross-reference, rather than back and forth sharing or static presentation. And as such, they have expanded to be understood as contingent archives or indexes, alongside any finite or singular published form they might take. Design practitioners like Mindy Su have adopted new terms like exdexing to better describe the features of these editorial designs, and others like the Serving Library declare a rationale which makes the case for combined modes of publishing and archiving. In their words, publishing and archiving have traditionally existed at opposite ends of knowledge production, but here, in accord with the cheap and easy electronic network, they coalesce in a single process. In this way, the Serving Library diagrams a reversible looping principle. It is an archive that publishes and a publisher that archives. In the wider sphere, libraries and archives of experimental publishing have come to adopt similar features in order to respond to these shifts and to best accommodate and record such dynamic and multifaceted publishing practices. Examples such as the Bootleg Library, Varia, Rhizome, and the Digital Archive of Artist Publishing have all responded through re-examinations of previous conventions of authorship, copyright, design, dissemination, and reception in recording, archiving, and preserving these evolving experimental publishing landscapes. They've also used the opportunity to revise and develop more accurate archival representations of historical practices that have previously been omitted or obscured within collections and archives due to their complex or unconventional nature. The archive Rhizome have described Mindy Su's work as representing a long history of experimentation with and critical thought about how humans might reconstruct themselves by way of technology. This resonates with Steve Jobs' call to connect the dots back to the past in understanding the crucial role of experimental exploration in future innovation. However, Mindy Su's advocacy for revisionist histories and her observation that utopias are contingent on the people thinking or imagining them calls for a revisitation and revision of past connections so that future experimentations and innovations like hers can serve to challenge and revise the status quo. Through this lens, experimental publishing can be understood in the past and right now in terms of formal objects and specific contexts, but also, really importantly, as a shifting site in which new publics are formed. So I'm going to end here with some web links to archives of some of the publications that have been featured in this talk. And I have a few of the physical hard copy publications here. So I've got the Cyberfeminism Index, one of the Whole Earth catalogues, and the New Woman's Survival catalogue, which anyone's welcome to look at in the break. Much more interesting than looking at slides of physical things. So thank you very much.